This is Howard Hughes, one of the richest and most influential men of 1930s. In 1939, Hughes quietly acquired controlling ownership of Trans World Airlines, not to run it like a business, but to reshape it around his vision. Once Hughes took control of TWA, he observed the fleet and he arrived at a conclusion that they were obsolete. So he approached the two dominant manufacturers, Boeing and Douglas, and demanded for an aircraft that can fly further, faster, higher, and also more comfortable than anything in service. But Boeing and Douglas refused his demand not because they lacked interest, but they didn't know how to make an aircraft that Hughes was asking for. Then, in 1939, he visited Lockheed with TWA's president and demanded for an aircraft. The president of Lockheed didn't deny it. Instead, he took the request to his two sharp engineers, Clarence Johnson and Hal Brad, and told them, come up with something. And then what they produced wasn't just an aircraft, it was a machine that absolutely pushed the piston engine aircraft to its mechanical limits. And they called it Lockheed Constellation.
Huge and powerful, yet precise and finely balanced as a jeweled watch. To make a 66-ton machine ride the air as delicately and surely as any bird is no easy job.
But here's the key part. All of this advanced technology came with a price that made the Constellation obsolete. Air travel back in 1930s was a nightmare. If you wanted to go from New York to Los Angeles, it wasn't one flight. You would leave New York, stop in Chicago, then Kansas City, then Albuquerque, sometimes in Winslow and Phoenix, just to refuel. A trip that takes 5 to 6 hours today could easily take up 15 or sometimes 18 hours back then. The air travel wasn't slow because people lacked ideas. It was slow because every extra mile demanded a sacrifice of fuel, safety, and reliability, or even all three of them. And this was a system that everyone had accepted until one man decided it wasn't good enough. Howard Hughes, he wasn't just an industrialist or a businessman, but he had power and a willingness to push the technology. After taking control of TWA, he believed one thing very clearly, that the future of the airlines wouldn't be decided by the routes or the branding, but the aircraft it flew. He believed that if TWA could operate an aircraft that was ahead of its time and none of the competitors had, everything else would follow. So Hughes went on to looking for a custom plane, not an improved version of what existed, but an aircraft that industry hadn't yet built. He wanted an aircraft that could fly higher with pressurized cabin across the United States non-stop and do it all with a speed over 300 miles per hour. In late 1930s, this wasn't considered as crazy, but it was unrealistic. But Hughes wasn't a man who could compromise. When Boeing and Douglas turned down his proposal, he didn't negotiate with them, he changed who he was talking to. And that's when he turned to Lockheed. At that time, Lockheed was a relatively small company that heavily relied on military contracts. Its only 4-engine aircraft, Excalibur, was still on paper. So when Hughes arrived with demanding for an aircraft, they didn't deny it, they chose to take a gamble. So the president of Lockheed brought the demand of Hughes to his two chief engineers, Clarence Johnson and Hal Brad, and told them that they have to work out something and make it possible. And the engineers realized that this request couldn't be met by refining the existing design. It required breaking almost every airline's rule of the time, and that kind of design couldn't happen publicly. Hughes financed almost every aspect of the project himself, and because this design couldn't happen publicly, Lockheed used the Excalibur as a cover-up so that they could keep the Constellation hidden. But things changed very quickly.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
This brought attention of US Army Air Force to Hughes' privately funded project. The military was interested in Lockheed Constellation because it promised that no other air transport at that time had promised: long range and high cruise speed, that made it ideal for long distance transport and VIP missions. On paper, US Army Air Force accepted the Constellation and redesignated it as C-69. But it was a time of war. Numbers and promises were suitable for paper. They needed solid proof.
At Burbank, California, the world's largest land-based transport plane, the Lockheed Constellation, prepares to start on her first public flight. A non-stop journey of some 2,600 miles across the states.
This proved that Constellation wasn't something that was flying around, but it raised a question that what made it different. The first thing everyone noticed was the shape. Long, curved, and that strange triple tail at the back. It didn't look like any airlines flying at that time. And this was not for the style. In late 1930s, piston engines had already been pushed to the limits. So if Lockheed and Hughes wanted more range or speed, they couldn't get it from engines anymore. The only place that was left to squeeze out the performance was the design. But the design itself couldn't lift the huge aircraft to higher altitudes. For that, Lockheed engineers chose Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engine, which was most powerful engine back then. Those engines gave Constellation the speed and range it needed. These propellers were 15 foot in diameter, or 4.5 meters if you like it. These four large propellers created a strong yaw force. So to compensate this force, it needed a huge vertical stabilizer. But the single fin would have made the plane taller and the plane wouldn't be able to fit in any hangars. But Kelly came up with something creative. He split the huge vertical stabilizer into smaller fins so that the aircraft was easily controlled and also could fit in any hangar around the world. While most of the aircraft cruised at 15,000 feet, Constellation cruised much higher, and for this, cabin pressurization became a necessary. And this very reason made flying in Constellation quieter and smoother. It was considered that flying in Constellation was a kind of luxury that only few could afford at that time. But every extra mile demanded something in return, and that bill arrived from the engines that had to run hotter and harder for several hours. The engine's R3350 was built for military purpose, and it was often credited as overheating and catching fire. And attaching that into a commercial airlines was no less than a gamble. But to meet the demand of Hughes, it was necessary and was often used to run at its peak performance for several hours in flight. In 1946, a Pan Am Constellation flying to London suffered a catastrophic engine failure. The airflow ripped the engine from its wing. It wasn't just an accident, it was a proof that design was living on the edge. At that moment, the whole aviation industry was stunned by looking at an engine that was ripped off from its wing in mid-air. Within weeks, airliners and regulators came to a conclusion and pulled off entire fleet of Constellation from its service. But Lockheed didn't bury its head. They reworked mounts, reinforced nacelles, and also improved the fire protection. The fixes worked enough for the regulators to let the fleet flying again. By early 1947, the Constellation resumed its service. But by getting Constellation back into the air, Lockheed didn't solve the problem, but they just bought some time. Even after the fixes, the Constellation was really battling this brutal race with speed and altitude. So the Lockheed's engineer tried to extract more power from its existing engine, not by increasing its size. So they came up with an idea called power recovery turbine. On paper, this was an absolutely brilliant idea, but practically the entire assembly was fragile and it ran at high RPM at extreme temperatures. The Constellation's curved and non-standard design meant almost no two buckle heads were identical. At a pressurized cabin, manufacturing and maintenance became far more complex. Every inspection meant checking miles of unique tubing, seals, and valves for leak, a process that took enormous time and manpower. And this complexity wasn't abstract. A single Lockheed Constellation carried 72 cylinders and 144 spark plugs. Every one of them had potential failure point that had to be inspected before each flight. And this constantly delayed the flights and also cancelled many of them. And this frustrated the schedulers and also airliners. Even though the Constellation was a revenue generator for airliners, it slowly started to become a burden. In 1957, Lockheed introduced L1649 Starliner. which was faster and had a better range than previous versions. But few months later, Boeing introduced its 707 prototype that rewrote aviation economics. On paper, the Coney could fly further, but in real world, the 707 flew faster, carried twice the passenger, and also spent more time flying than sitting in hangar. And that difference meant more profit so that airliners could print more money. By the early 1960s, the jet age made Constellation economically obsolete, and airliners started quietly pushing it out of their fleet. In 1958, the last Lockheed Constellation rolled off from its assembly line. But I would call the Lockheed Constellation a magnificent failure. Magnificent because it did achieve everything that it had set out. It shrunk the travel time, it normalized the cabin pressurization, and it set a new standard for range and speed in aviation. Kelly Johnson's masterpiece design made the Constellation one of the most recognizable aircraft in the world.